How do we understand ethical theory, moral philosophy? In this lecture video, we're going to be assessing ethical theory from Socrates' Question, looking at the first chapter of Bernard Williams's book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Most of this is really a setting up for Williams's critique as he surveys each different moral philosophy throughout his book. Some of that will come out, some questions will be raised that will eventually lead to that throughout this lecture. But what we're going to focus on is two things. One, what does it mean to think ethically? Or what is the kind of question that moral or ethical philosophy is chiefly concerned with? And what are the potential questions that might arise from it, and maybe potential problems as well? So we begin with Socrates' question. It's a philosophical question. How should one live? Williams says, like Socrates, Plato hoped that one could direct one's life, if necessary, redirect it, through an understanding that was distinctly philosophical, that is to say, general and abstract, rationally reflective, and concerned with what can be known through different kinds of inquiry. So, what it means first to ask a philosophical question is complicated and is itself a philosophical question. Philosophy in the West comes from the Greek words philo and sophia, the love of wisdom. It's a concern with truth for truth's sake. And in the pursuit of truth and being concerned with truth, one is concerned with maybe perhaps two things, we might say. Trying to unburden or shake what we take for granted in our maybe everyday lives, but also to seek justifications. Logical reasoning is involved in this case, right? To seek ideas, theories, beliefs that are justified by premises, by another set of beliefs that ultimately would need to be justified as well. And in this case, what Williams is saying then is this kind of a philosophical question where Socrates says what we are concerned with is the question of how one should live. We are looking for something that is rationally reflective. We're looking for reasons to give why one theory of how one should live is better for another theory. So we're not looking for, in some descriptive sense, how different people live. We want to know in some normative sense, how should one live? How ought one live? What is the correct way to live? But in some cases, well, we're not just looking for a particular case of how should I, Austin, live as far as my capacity in the place I live, the time I live, etc., but something general that can both be applied to the particular. So this question comes out of the dialogue of Plato's Republic. A couple questions are involved that lead to ultimately this question of how one should live. The question revolves around, first, what is justice? So we want to know, what is the nature of justice? What is the essence? What is it that makes justice what it is, such that if it didn't have that one thing, it wouldn't be justice? What is it that makes it such that when we, let's say, punish someone for a crime, we might say this is carrying out justice? Or maybe if I just slap my friend, we would say that is not a case of justice, right? What is the difference? How can we know what justice is so we can correctly apply it? But also, we want to know, if we can know what justice is it by knowing what it is? Are we able to know whether it's worth pursuing, whether it is worthy? And in that case, is justice more valuable than injustice? Should we pursue injustice over justice? Why would justice be worthy? Finally, assuming justice is worthy, worth pursuing, how does one actually live justly? What does it mean to live a just life? So these are the kind of basic questions that, to some extent, the Republic is concerned with. And out of this, we get the kind of core philosophical, ethical question. How should one live? All of these questions, the ideas Williams is saying, Socrates is really trying to get at the question, how should one live? Now, why would we begin moral philosophy with the question, how should one live? Why not something like, what is our duty? How may we be good? How can we be happy? Why aren't those sufficient answers to begin moral philosophy with? But what Williams points out is that in some way or another, the question of duty, for example, already presupposes a whole list of things, a bunch of concerns. It already presupposes ways of living that would involve duties. How may we be good? Again, already presupposes certain states of affair that would lead one to prioritize good. Or how can we be happy? Again, presupposes all kinds of ways that we live such that we want to orient our life towards happiness and whatever happiness may involve in terms of how we live. There's something more basic, more fundamental in the question, how should one live? Because how should one live is getting at life itself. It's getting at distinctively, perhaps, human life, and it's getting at this distinctive question, a distinctively moral question, which is, we exist. Perhaps there are better and worse ways of existing. Are there? How would we know? How would we go about following through and achieving what is that better way of living? The question, how should one live, is impersonal. The way Socrates asks it does not ask, again, how should I, Austin, live? Or how should you live? It's a question that applies to anyone and everyone and no one. Williams says, the implication is that something relevant or useful can be said to anyone in general. And this implies that something general can be said, something that embraces or shapes the individual ambitions each person may bring to the question, how should I live? So there's a way in which the question, how should one live, if it is applied to human beings, well, human beings are varied in how they exist, right? There's a kind of multiplicity of ways that we can exist, and each one of us, in some way or another, is different from another. So at one and the same time, it is impersonal, this basic ethical question, because it seeks to get rid of our differences and yet simultaneously account for our differences, or at least those differences which are deemed important to the question, how should one live? But we might want to ask, what, or maybe even who, made this kind of impersonal question leave out? If we want to reduce our differences such that it can apply to everyone, are there kinds of people maybe that aren't accounted for in the ethical theory? Are some people privileged over others? Are certain kinds of goods privileged over others? Some things might be deemed worth pursuing, some others. Maybe duty is more important than well-being. Why? Is that correct? Does that account for how we live our lives in the most basic sense of what we take to be most important, most essential to our existence? We've been speaking of ethical philosophy, but it can also be referred to oftentimes as moral philosophy. And in fact, many people use the terms morality and ethics interchangeably. And perhaps it is possible as long as it's defined by someone that that's what they want to do. But what Williams points out is a difference has arisen in using the term morality. And we can see this originating from the Latin taking up the Greek and how that changes in translation. Where originally the word used to speak about ethics changed to morality, but both were responding in a different way to disposition or custom. The question is, how is morality understood now? So Williams says, the word morality has by now taken on a more distinctive content, and I am going to suggest that morality should be understood as a particular development of the ethical, one that has a special significance in modern Western culture. It peculiarly emphasizes certain ethical notions rather than others, developing in particular a special notion of obligation, and it has some peculiar presuppositions. So, according to Williams, we can see morality as almost a kind of an interpretation of ethics, but one where morality gives itself sharp boundaries in comparison to ethics. That when we ask the question, how ought one to live, in an ethical sense, we're talking in a base sense of living. But with morality, we're talking about obligations, particular things that are involved in living. Now, again, in the last chapter of his book, it's titled Morality, the Peculiar Institution. And what Williams wants to critique in morality is whether or not moral philosophy, the theories that come out of morality, actually are at odds or incoherent with ethical life itself. But again, we'll have to put that to the side for this lecture video. Now, some domains of morality, Williams says, look backwards or sideways. So one might be obligations. So a kind of deontology might have certain obligations that we have to fulfill. But you can also have a certain kind of virtue ethics, like maybe Confucian or Mengzian virtue ethics, which focus on family obligations, whereby in that case, what it means to be moral is to first privilege your immediate family, then your friends, and then the wider society, and then perhaps all of humanity, such that there's privilege given to the closer beings around you in a kind of web of existence. But another kind of morality that looks backwards or sideways is duty. So duties can be things that pertain to a particular station one occupies. Now, this can be a particular station in the sense of I have a certain duty as a teacher, I have a certain duty as a parent, but also we can talk about having duty as a human being, perhaps. Again, in the case of deontology, it could be the case that I have a certain duty to never tell a lie because I possess reason. And if I use reason to work out what the supreme principle of morality is, it shows me that I would be misusing reason if I lie to other human beings who also possess reason, because I would be violating them by taking them as a kind of mere means for my own wishes. Now, some domains of morality look forward, like consequentialism. So consequentialism is concerned with the consequences. What effects do your actions promote? And some kinds of consequentialism want to promote certain kinds of actions over others. The most prominent form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. With utilitarianism, there's a promotion of pleasure or happiness. So that's the specific effect we want to produce. And we judge whether or not we're on a good person, or whether or not we are a good person, based on whether or not the actions we produce now, or the actions we perform now, produce in the future good outcomes. And good outcomes for utilitarianism are those that produce pleasure or happiness. Now, some domains of morality are based actually on character, not necessarily consequences, not necessarily focus on looking forward, but the development of yourself as a human being in terms of how you act. So this would be, for example, the domain of virtue ethics. Williams says, the importance of an ethical concept need not lie in its being itself an element of first personal deliberation. The deliberations of people who are trying to be more generous or braver are different from the deliberations of those who are not like that. But the difference does not mainly lie in their thinking about themselves in terms of generosity or courage. So in the case of virtue ethics, for example, it is not necessarily the case that, let's say utilitarianism, I can know in all times and places what the correct action is to perform, because I've used reason to determine that the principle of utility is the supreme principle of morality. But with virtue ethics, you don't have this kind of deliberation in a kind of theoretically removed sense from the practical. There's a greater emphasis in virtue ethics on practical wisdom, such that in the development of my character, I should just almost have instinct, knowing what to do. What is the correct action to perform in any given instance? Other kinds of ethical considerations are ethical egoism. Now, this says that each person ought to pursue their own self-interest, such that it doesn't mean that everyone necessarily does always do what is in their best self-interest, but everyone ought to do what they think is in their best self-interest. And some cases, like psychological egoism, say that's actually what people do, is they always act in what they think is their best own self-interest. That's not necessarily immoral. Some other ethical and moral theories might say that ethical egoism is immoral or unethical. But it can still be an ethical theory that says perhaps this is the teleological reason. This is what human beings ought to do, what they were born to do, or this is actually what produces the best outcomes. Many times ethical egoists, like maybe Ayn Rand or Mandeville, might say something like this. Another kind of ethical consideration is that of relativism, is the relativity of moral goods. We can distinguish at least two kinds. So subjective relativism is where we have the claim that what is morally correct is according to each individual person. But cultural relativism says what is morally correct is dependent on the society that one person lives in. We also have counter-ethical motivations. In some cases, someone might say we need to promote malevolence, but we would say, well, that is not an ethical thing to promote. So we can see a difference in, let's say, counter-ethical motivations from ethical egoism, where we're saying each person ought to pursue their own self-interest, and that's for the good of both that individual and everyone. Whereas in the case of counter-ethical motivations like malevolence, just wanting to perform, to commit harm on others, this might, isn't going to be the best thing to do for others, and it might not even be the best thing to do for oneself. So there are important differences between these kinds of considerations. Finally, we can also think about the kind of constituencies that ethics and morality is concerned with. Some of these I've already mentioned might be the case of the family or of community, of nation, whether we privilege certain constituencies or whether a specific moral theory is only relevant to one kind of constituency, such that you could have different ethical theories, maybe one for the family, one for the community, one for the nation. You might run into problems if they don't cohere, or you might seek different ethical theories that respond to the different particular constituencies in a way that seeks a kind of reflective equilibrium where the theories still cohere. But what Williams says, again, in his wanting to point out how morality is different from mere ethics, is that in the case of morality, the only ethical constituency is the universal constituency. That in morality, again, there's this emphasis on the impersonal. That what is moral is so in the sense for everyone and no one. Because it's not for any particular individual. It is for all human beings, but not just all human beings that exist now. It is just the good, perhaps for all sentient beings, perhaps for all rational beings, right? Whatever the ethical theory might say is the case. So some of these moral theories might be some like deontological theories. So, in the case of Kant, we might say, well, or in the case of actually Hindu ethics, like we can see in the Bhagavad Gita, where you might want to say, well, all ethical considerations should be reduced to duty. And in the case that we see in the Bhagavad Gita, it says, what is morally correct is always what your caste duty is. Maybe in the case of, we might want to say, Kant's ethics, we're going to reduce all ethical considerations to duty, but your duty comes from reason, not your caste status. Teleological theories are those which take the primary concern of ethics to be the production of the best possible state of affairs. Oftentimes, the kind of chief teleological theory is virtue ethics, because virtue ethics says there's a purpose for there's a purpose for human beings, and their purpose is to flourish in their existence, such that when one flourishes, they achieve, in the case of Aristotle, eudaimonia, a kind of a happiness that is of a life well lived. But a question that Williams wants to ask is morality correct to reduce all ethical considerations to only maybe one or two kinds, say duty or happiness, pleasure, states of affairs? He says, perhaps we need as many concepts to describe it as we find need, and no fewer. What if it's the case that existence itself, all the different ways we find ourselves thrown into situations, there's a multiplicity of different considerations that we have to take up? Is morality correct then in wanting to downplay most of those considerations and say, well, they're not really moral considerations? Maybe they're some kind of consideration, but they're something else. So getting back to Socrates' question, Williams says that Socrates' question is an example of an ambitious, personal, practical question, because it is, even though it's impersonal, it is for each individual to realize. It is for each individual to put into action. That we can think of some personal practical questions as, what am I to do? Right? We often think of moral dilemmas. We would ask that question, what am I to do in this situation? Or what shall I do, maybe in the future, looking forward? Williams says, when the time for action is immediate, there is less room for these alternatives. So it is paradoxical if I come out with an answer of this kind and immediately fail to do what I said I was immediately going to do. The question, what should I do, allows rather more space between thought and action. So Williams says what Socrates really means, even though it's an example, an ambitious example of a personal practical question, is something more reflective, something more philosophical. How has one most reason to live? So when we ask, how should I live, we're really asking, what is the most rational way one can live? There are two ways I think we can see this. One is the famous Socratic quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," from Plato's Apology, right? That one does not live a truly worthy life if they do not examine the beliefs they hold, if they do not question whether or not they believe the right things, whether or not they're doing the right things. That there's this sense of, to live a good life is to always, in a sense, be reflectively humble, to always be willing to consider that one has not actually grasped the truth, that one should always be open to further pursuing the truth, and in this case, ethical truth and an ethical, moral life. But also by asking, how has one most reason to live, we're searching for normativity. We are searching for that which says, this is the case, that I ought to do X. Right? When we talk about perhaps a custom, we say, well, this is just how one lives. But when we talk about something that's normative, we say one ought to do this. And in this case, the idea is reason can provide us that normativity. So I want to end with this quote from Williams and two questions that he leaves us with. He says, Socrates' question is a general question about what to do because it asks how to live. And it is also, in a sense, a timeless question, since it invites me to think about my life from no particular point in it. These two facts make it a reflective question. That does not determine the answer, but it does affect it. Answering a practical question at a particular time, in a particular situation, I shall be particularly concerned with what I want then. But Socrates' question I ask at no particular time, or rather, the time when I no doubt ask it has no particular relation to the question. So I am bound by the question itself to take a more general, indeed a longer term perspective on life. This does not determine that I give the answers of long-term prudence. The answer to the question might be, the best way for me to live is to do at any given time what I most want to do at that time. But if I have a weakness for prudence, the nature of Socrates' question is likely to bring it out, such that then I will notice, hey, I'm acting too prudently. But Williams asks, how far does reflection commit us? And why should we be committed to reflection? Is there something presupposed about the normativity of reflection? And is reflection something that goes beyond the basic questions of what it means to live ethically, the basic questions of life? Perhaps not, but maybe. And the only way to know is to engage the question philosophically.